At the end of World War II, the high-ranking leaders of the SS attempted to escape the total collapse of the Third Reich. Figures like Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler spent weeks fleeing across German territory, hiding under false identities and disguised as ordinary soldiers. Himmler managed to evade capture for nearly 3 weeks, posing as a sergeant with an eye patch, until he was detained by British troops. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer captured alive, was arrested on May 12, 1945, in a remote mountain cabin near Lake Altauser in the Austrian Alps. He had taken refuge there under a false identity, using the name Dr. Fritz, hoping to go unnoticed among the local mountaineers. Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Economic Administration and responsible for the forced labor system in the camps, was captured in May 1946. He organized the economic exploitation of prisoners and oversaw the logistics of extermination. He was tried for crimes against humanity in the Pohl trial. In 1951, he was executed at Landsberg prison. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. This unfolded in the spring of 1945, and at the same time army units across Europe were undertaking similar tasks. The German army had finally collapsed and war was soon to be over. Attention began to turn to ensuring the men who had started this war, who had brought this untold suffering to hundreds of millions of people across the world, did not escape justice. Of all the parts of the Nazi state, it is undoubtedly the SS that were hated the most. As Hitler's elite paramilitary organization, the SS operated concentration and extermination camps, orchestrated mass killings, and carried out the systematic persecution of Jews, political opponents, and other targeted groups. Their ruthless actions during the Holocaust and their role in suppressing dissent made them a symbol of terror and cruelty. Unlike the regular army, the SS was deeply ideologically driven, loyal only to Hitler, and responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the regime, earning them widespread hatred during and after the Nazi era. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the man apprehended while hiding out in an alpine cabin, was the most senior SS officer to be caught alive by the Allies and the man chosen to represent the organization at the Nuremberg Trials. He had spent much of the war as chief of the Reich Security Main Office of RSHA, giving him oversight of all SS activity, including that of the Gestapo, the concentration camps, and Nazis' intelligence agency. After being caught hiding out in the Austrian mountains, he was taken to be tried. Initially absent from proceedings due to health complications, allegedly suffering from subarachnoid hemorrhages and gallstones, Kaltenbrunner eventually appeared before the court, claiming he bore no direct responsibility for the crimes committed under his watch as head of the RSHA. In his defense, Kaltenbrunner attempted to distance himself from the atrocities carried out by the Nazi regime. He insisted that his role was largely administrative and confined to intelligence matters, not the implementation of mass murder. He claimed that documents bearing his signature had been fraudulently signed by subordinates, and he denied any prior knowledge of the Holocaust before 1943. He insisted that, as a subordinate of Heinrich Himmler, he was completely innocent, that all responsibility fell solely on the leader of the organization. This was patently ridiculous. Evil as Himmler was, he would have achieved nothing if acting alone. It was only with the help of others such as Kaltenbrunner that the Holocaust was brought into effect. These were men who acted of free will, who not only followed orders but issued them, who sought to maximize the killing of innocent human beings. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was a devoted and loyal Nazi who firmly believed in the ideals of the SS and its vision for a racially pure state. He strongly embraced anti-Semitism, viewing Jews as enemies of Germany and actively supporting measures to exclude and persecute them. It is said that even Himmler feared him, as he was an imposing man at over 6'4" and with scarring down his face. He visited many concentration camps, and there are even reports of inmates being killed in front of him to demonstrate different methods of execution. Remarkably, despite this, at his trial, he claimed that he had protested the mistreatment of Jews and worked to end the final solution, a claim met with open laughter in the courtroom. These statements were not only contradicted by extensive documentation and eyewitness testimony, but also by his own visits to concentration camps such as Mauthausen. Ultimately, the tribunal found Kaltenbrunner guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity on the 30th of September 1946 and executed by hanging the following day. To prevent his grave from being honored or becoming a site of neo-Nazi pilgrimage, his body was cremated with the ashes scattered in the waters of a nearby river. This was the same fate to meet many of the other most senior Nazis tried at Nuremberg. Heinrich Himmler. The ID card found in that Alpine cabin marked him out as the number 2 man of the SS. The man whose card showed the number 1 was Heinrich Himmler. Himmler is widely considered to be one of the most evil men to ever live and a primary architect of the Holocaust. He took over the SS in 1929 at a time when the organization had a mere 280 members. By the end of the war, Himmler had grown it into a vast organization, which almost functioned as a country itself with a police force, courts, and army. Himmler's ideology was deeply rooted in racist pseudoscience and unwavering loyalty to Adolf Hitler. He cultivated a cult-like environment within the SS, encouraging cruelty and blind obedience. Under his direction, the SS committed countless atrocities across occupied Europe, including mass shootings, forced sterilizations, and medical experiments on prisoners. Himmler also organized and expanded the concentration camp system, transforming it into a network of death camps, including Auschwitz, where over 1 million people were murdered. Under his watch, millions of Jews, Romani people, Soviet POWs and other groups were gassed, shot, starved, or worked to death. So what was the fate of the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany? By the spring of 1945, with Nazi Germany on the brink of defeat, Himmler attempted to save himself by negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies through intermediaries. This was done without Hitler's knowledge, and the Führer only found out about them through a public BBC news broadcast. Hitler saw this as a deep and personal betrayal, and in one of last acts as Führer, dismissed Himmler and ordered his arrest. Realizing he was now a hunted man, Himmler went into hiding under a false identity, calling himself Heinrich Hitzinger, hoping to avoid capture. His papers were well faked, but bore a stamp which by this point was known to be being used by SS officers attempting to conceal themselves. It was because of this stamp that he was detained as he tried to pass through an Allied military checkpoint. However, his disguise still held, and it was a civilian interrogation center that he was brought to, one run by the British. Realizing that he was running out of options, Himmler decided to reveal who he really was, perhaps hoping he could somehow use his high status as a bargaining chip. He stated simply to the British commandant of the camp, "I am Reich Minister Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, and I want to talk to Eisenhower." Imagine the delusion it takes to oversee one of history's most monstrous regimes, lose a war catastrophically, and then walk into custody thinking you're entitled to a meeting with Eisenhower. Himmler tried to portray himself as a diplomat even as he behaved like a criminal trying to avoid detection. After confirming he was who he said he was, the commander had Himmler moved to undergo a medical examination. The medical officer performing this found an object with a blue tip concealed in the SS leader's mouth. As the doctor began to try and remove it, Himmler suddenly wrestled his head away and crushed the object between his teeth. The doctor and soldiers present tried to prevent the inevitable, even dunking Himmler's head in cold water and trying to remove the contents of the pill from inside of his mouth. However, it was all to no avail. Within minutes, the fate of Heinrich Himmler, a man directly responsible for the deaths of millions, was sealed. His body was buried in an anonymous grave on the Lüneburger Heath. Himmler's fall was a slap in the face to the millions who suffered and died under his orders. While other top Nazis like Göring and Hess were dragged before the world at Nuremberg to answer for their crimes, Himmler escaped through death, and that enraged many. Survivors, grieving families, and the Allies were robbed of the chance to publicly expose and condemn one of the most evil men of the 20th century. Instead of facing a courtroom, The architect of genocide vanished into history without a word of remorse, no cross-examination, no admission of guilt, just silence. His death left behind questions unanswered, justice incomplete, and outrage that still lingers to this day. Karl Wolff. Despite the atrocities committed by the SS and the fear and hatred the organization stirred up in their enemies, not all of its officers paid this ultimate price for membership. One who escaped death after the war was Karl Wolff. Wolff spent much of the war as Himmler's chief of staff. This powerful position gave him a high level of access throughout the Reich. He also served as a liaison between the SS and Hitler himself. He was close enough to Hitler to personally ask him to approve his divorce in 1943, after Himmler had denied it. By the end of the war, Wolff was serving as the supreme SS and police leader in Nazi-occupied Italy. By this point, Wolff had committed numerous war crimes. These included his inhuman treatment of Italian partisans trying to overthrow Nazi rule, as well as his involvement in the Holocaust. Wolff was under no illusions that the war was over and that Nazi Germany had lost. His mind began to turn to the world post-war. With Germany defeated, he knew it was likely that top Nazi officials would be held responsible for the deaths caused, and he knew that his role within the SS would be investigated. In a bid to grant himself some goodwill, he used his position as the leader of troops in Italy to organize their early surrender to the Allies in what came to be known as Operation Sunrise. Wolff was one of the most senior officers involved in the operation, which eventually saw the capitulation of forces in Italy come into effect on the 2nd of May, a full week ahead of Germany's unconditional surrender. This gamble paid off, and, as a result, Wolff was not prosecuted in the Nuremberg Trials, instead serving as a witness for the prosecution, testifying against his former colleagues. As a result, Wolff served a mere 4 years in prison, tried simply for his membership of the SS rather than his role in the Holocaust. After being released in 1949, he worked as an advertising executive. This was a man who had written gleefully to a friend his special joy that 5,000 Jews were going to Treblinka extermination camp every day. Wolff's heinous past would catch up to him, however. In 1962, during the trial of another top SS official in Israel, evidence emerged linking Wolff to the organization of the 1944 deportation of Italian Jews. He was subsequently arrested and tried in West Germany. In 1964, Wolff was found guilty of orchestrating the deportation of 300,000 Jews to the Treblinka extermination camp, resulting in their deaths. He received a 15-year prison sentence in Straubing, but served only part of it, being released in 1971 after suffering a heart attack. Otto Olandorf and Friedrich Yuckl. When we think of the Holocaust, the image that often comes to mind is that of extermination camps, industrialized killing centers with gas chambers at their core. But long before these camps were built, the genocide had already begun. In the occupied Soviet Union, the Holocaust started not with gas, but with bullets. In the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, SS forces, often with the help of local collaborators, carried out mass shootings of Jewish communities and of others deemed undesirable. Entire towns were marched to the edges of forests, fields, and ravines, forced to dig their own graves and murdered where they stood. This chapter of history, often overshadowed in public memory, has been described by Patrick Dubois as the Holocaust by bullets, a brutal, intimate form of mass murder that claimed the lives of millions. This genocide was perpetrated by a small number of specially formed task forces called Einsatzgruppe. They were formed by the personal orders of Hitler and Himmler and placed under SS jurisdiction. These mobile killing units operated behind the advancing German front lines during Operation Barbarossa, supposedly to secure the front against Parisian resistance within the new Nazi borders. 4 of these Einsatzgruppe units were created, with SS commander Friedrich Yuckl placed in charge of them. Initially, the Einsatzgruppen were limited to suspected communists and Bolsheviks. However, blinded and led by virile anti-Semitism, Yuckl and his SS seniors saw all Jews as being Bolsheviks and a threat to their power. This meant that the unit went from place to place, rounding up all Jewish men they could find and killing them. In the summer of 1941, this escalated. Himmler now ordered that no Jewish people be spared. The units were now to kill all women and children too. It is this moment that many people point to as the start of the Holocaust, the moment that any pretense this was about security or the war effort was erased. This was now an attempt to exterminate an entire group of people. Yuckl followed these new orders closely and went about creating and fine-tuning his methods of mass murder. The approach, he eventually decided, caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women and children, and came to be known as the Yuckl system, named in his honor. It was this method he used in the Rumbula massacre of 1941. In the Riga ghetto, the Jewish residents were forced from their homes and organized into columns of 500 to 1,000 people. Next, they marched them about 10 kilometers south to pre-dug killing pits. There, victims were stripped of their clothing and valuables, herded through a double line of guards and forced to lie face down in the pits, often atop bodies of those already murdered. To minimize costs, each victim was executed with a single shot to the back of the head. Some shooters fired from the edge of the pit, while others shot from within. Those not killed immediately were buried alive when the pits were filled in. Of the over 25,000 Jews brought to the killing site, only 3 would survive. The whole operation took around 1,700 personnel, though almost all the shooting was carried out by the Einsatzgruppen men. By now, all experienced murderers, Yuckl oversaw the 2 days of slaughter. The same method was used by Yuckl in the infamous massacres of Babi Yar and the Kamianets-Podilsky. Yuckl often personally attended these mass killings, overseeing the horror as tens of thousands of human beings were slaughtered in a single day. So brutal and up-close was the shooting that members of the units complained of the brutality, particularly when executing the women and children at such close quarters. Seeing the psychological impact of this one Einsatzgruppe commander took matters into his own hands. His name was Otto Olandorf. Olandorf trained as an economist, though quickly rose through the ranks of the Nazi Party and the SS, which he joined in 1926 as a fanatical youngster. In many ways, he was the perfect Nazi, efficient, effective, and loyal. He approached mass murder with this chilling precision and emotional detachment, transforming killing into a regimented, impersonal operation. He deliberately avoided the intimate brutality of close-range executions, such as the common shot to the back of the neck used by Yuckl. Instead, he ordered victims to be lined up and executed from a distance by firing squads, often assigning multiple shooters to a single person to diffuse individual responsibility. Himmler eventually began experimenting with other methods of mass murder, namely vans onto which victims could be loaded onto and then gassed. Olandorf's unit would generally use these vans at night to avoid detection. After the murders were completed, other Jewish prisoners would be forced to unload the bodies and clean down the vans. When this cleaning was complete, these workers were then shot by Olandorf's men. Amongst this barbarity, he complained about inefficiency, unhappy that only 15 to 25 people could be murdered at a time. His efforts to sanitize mass murder behind a veneer of professionalism revealed the calculated inhumanity at the heart of his leadership and at much of SS's ideological leadership. It is estimated that the 4 Einsatzgruppen were either directly responsible for or orchestrated the murders of between 1.5 and 2 million civilians in Soviet territory during World War II. The majority of these were Jewish or Romani. As the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, Otto Olandorf joined Heinrich Himmler in a desperate attempt to flee from Flensburg, where the remnants of the Nazi leadership had gathered. Hoping to evade capture by the Allies, Olandorf traveled with a small group of loyal subordinates. Their escape, however, was short-lived. On May 23, 1945, British forces apprehended Olandorf and the others near the town of Lüneburg. Yuckl, meanwhile, was captured by the Soviet Union in Germany during the last days of the war. In captivity, both men spoke openly about the atrocities committed by themselves and others within the SS and Nazi state. In fact, Olandorf became one of the main sources of information for much of the horror. The pair spoke plainly and coldly about these acts of mass murder, with neither showing regret or remorse, while also implicating many of his former colleagues. Yuckl, in his trial, stated plainly, "I have to take full responsibility for what happened in the borders of Ostland within SS, SD and the Gestapo. This greatly increases my guilt. My fate is in the hands of the High Court." The fate the High Court opted for was death. He was found guilty of war crimes and hanged on 3 February 1946 in front of a crowd of 4,000 spectators. Olandorf faced the same punishment as the primary defendant in the Einsatzgruppen trials of 1947 and 1948, prosecuted by the US. In this trial, he was ultimately convicted of the mass murder of 90,000 people and sentenced to death. His execution was delayed, meaning that it wasn't until June 1951 that American authorities carried out the sentence, making Olandorf among the final Nazi war criminals executed by the United States for atrocities committed during the war. Despite these confessions of the group's leaders, of the thousands of men who worked in these death squads, each responsible for shooting hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent people, only around 100 were ever tried for war crimes. Odilo Globnik plus Kurt Dalu. The careers of Odilo Globnik and Kurt Dalu intertwined in the vast and violent machinery of the Holocaust. Both were early followers of Hitler, devoted not only in action but in ideology. Each played a central role in shaping the SS into the ruthless organization it became, though their legacies diverge slightly in character. Dalu, the methodical architect of police terror. Globnik, the fanatical executor of mass murder. Dalu's ascent began in the early days of the Nazi movement. Originally a member of the SA, he shifted to the SS at Hitler's request in 1930, a move that marked a critical transformation in Nazi power dynamics. From Berlin, Dalu helped define the SS as a fiercely loyal, ideologically pure elite. His men proved their worth in August 1930 by violently repelling a rebellion from within the rogue SA faction led by Walter Stennes. Hitler responded with a public letter to Dalu, praising their loyalty. "SS man, your honor is loyalty," a phrase that soon became a motto of SS. Rising swiftly, Dalu was appointed SS Obergruppenführer and given control of the northern SS, while Heinrich Himmler managed the south. This division helped expand SS influence across Germany and lay the foundation for its role as a state within a state. But Dalu was far more than a bureaucrat. During the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, he was often at the sites of mass executions. He personally oversaw the activities of Police Battalion 307 during the massacre of over 4,000 Jews near Brest-Litovsk, and was present for another mass killing in Minsk. In 1941, he signed off on deportations of Jews to ghettos and killing centers in Riga and Minsk, fully aware of what awaited them. By July 1942, he was at the table with Himmler in high-level meetings planning Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jews of occupied Poland. This plan was headed up by Odilo Globnik. He had been installed by Himmler as SS and police leader in the Lublin district. Some historians argue that Globnik may have even suggested the idea of dedicated extermination camps, a chilling thought given how central those camps became to the Holocaust. What is certain is that he oversaw their construction and operation. Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, where more than 1.5 million Jews were murdered in gas chambers under his supervision. Globnik approached genocide with terrifying zeal. He personally visited the death camps, oversaw the logistics of body disposal, and even took pride in the speed and efficiency of the killings. His operations were not merely acts of obedience, they reflected a radical commitment to Hitler's vision of racial annihilation. After the success of Operation Reinhard, Himmler transferred Globnik to Italy, where he continued his work, targeting partisans and remaining Jews. When the war ended in 1945, the reckoning began. Dalu was captured by British forces and extradited to Czechoslovakia to face trial for his role in massacres during the occupation. At his trial, He was defiant, portraying himself as a loyal servant of the Führer and claiming admiration from 3 million policemen. The court rejected this self-justification. On October 23, 1946, he was sentenced to death. The next day, he was hanged at Pankrak prison in Prague. Globnik, on the other hand, never stood trial, arrested by British troops in Austria. But before he could be interrogated, he died. Both men were responsible for shaping and executing one of the most terrifying crimes in human history. One engineered the bureaucracy of genocide, the other gave it physical form. One faced justice, the other fled it through poison. But in the end, neither escaped the legacy of what they helped build, a legacy soaked in blood and remembered as a cautionary tale of how ideology, power and fanaticism can converge into catastrophe. Fritz Katsman. By now you may be noticing a pattern. The fate of these senior SS men falls into 3 main categories. They either take themselves out of the picture to avoid the humiliation of a trial, are tried and executed, or serve some prison time before being released. In some way or another, all of these outcomes can be seen as justice being served, albeit imperfectly and often too late. These fates at least acknowledged the magnitude of the atrocities they helped perpetrate. One SS man who managed to escape justice entirely was Fritz Katsman. He proved himself to be an ideologically driven mass murderer throughout the war, with his crimes including ordering the mass execution of 55,000 to 65,000 Jews, overseeing the creation of ghettos, orchestrating deportations to extermination camps, and facilitating mass murders through the use of gas chambers at the Stutthof concentration camp. His actions placed him among the most brutal enforcers of the Holocaust. Despite the staggering magnitude of his crimes, after the war, while the world hunted down Nazi war criminals with increasing intensity, Fritz Katsman managed to simply vanish. He didn't escape to South America like many others. He quietly lived out the rest of his life in peace and anonymity, right in the heart of West Germany. This was one of the most vicious men in Nazi-occupied Poland. Instead of answering for his crimes, he built a new life for himself. Under the false name Bruno Albrecht, Katsman lived in Darmstadt, working as a traveling salesman. A man who had overseen ghettos, deportations and death squads now knocked on doors selling goods. The contrast is almost grotesque in its banality. He lived in the shadows, never even contacting his wife or 5 children. To them, he had simply disappeared without a trace. In reality, he was hiding in plain sight. It wasn't until 1957, on his deathbed, that the truth came out. Suffering in a hospital and sensing the end was near, Katsman confessed his true identity to a Catholic priest just days before his death on September 19th. And so, one of the architects and perpetrators of genocide and a man responsible for unfathomable suffering, died peacefully in a hospital bed, never having answered for his crimes. No courtroom, no verdict, no justice for the hundreds of thousands whose lives he destroyed. He got away with it, managing to simply vanish into post-war German society, shielded by a false name and a system overwhelmed with chaos. The only positive part of his legacy is an unintended one. It was one of his official wartime reports to his superiors. It came to be known as the Katsman Report and helped Allied investigators piece together part of the vast machinery of evil perpetrated by the Nazi regime. Written in Berlin, the Katsman Report detailed in cold bureaucratic language how a total of 434,329 Jews within the district of Galicia in Nazi-occupied Poland were rounded up and murdered. It reads like a chilling business report, stripped of humanity, outlining logistical accomplishments and figures with horrifying detachment. More recent scholars have questioned how reliable a source it is, given that Fritz was clearly exaggerating his role to impress his superiors and make his operation appear more efficient. Nonetheless, the document served as a key piece of evidence in uncovering the extent of the genocide committed by Hitler's ever-loyal SS. Katzman's report, though riddled with self-serving lies, remains one of the few surviving primary documents of its kind, inadvertently exposing the systematic nature of the Holocaust. Ironically, while Katsman escaped justice, his own words helped convict others. Adolf Iikman. Katsman got away, evaded justice, and the same fate seemed sealed for Adolf Iikman as he went about his new life in Argentina 15 years after the war. Little did he know he was being watched. In the end, his story would become one of the most dramatic, far-reaching episodes in the quest for Nazi accountability. His fate did not rest in the hands of post-war tribunals or Allied powers. It was shaped by an extraordinary manhunt, a covert kidnapping across continents, and a trial that would reshape how the world understood the Holocaust. Adolf Iikman was not a field commander or a concentration camp guard. He was a bureaucrat, a man behind a desk, but one who meticulously planned and managed the logistics of mass murder. Iikman was the head of the office which organized the transport of millions of Jews to ghettos, concentration camps, and extermination centers. Iikman didn't pull the trigger or drop the gas pellets himself. He made sure the logistics ran smoothly, that the victims, murders, and tools of death were in the right place at the right time. By the war's end, Iikman was a wanted man. But, unlike Himmler or Göring, Iikman disappeared. And for over a decade, the world didn't know where he was. In the years following the war, Adolf Iikman assumed a new name and built a quiet life in Argentina. With help from a network of Nazi sympathizers and the so-called ratlines that helped fugitives escape Europe, Iikman slipped out of Germany and arrived in Buenos Aires in 1950. There he found work as a government contractor, lived in a modest house, and faded into the background. In the 1950s, Israel's intelligence service, Mossad, began picking up whispers of Iikman's presence in Argentina. Most of the legwork was done by Holocaust survivor Lothar Hermann. In 1956, Sylvia, the daughter of Hermann, became romantically involved with a young man who openly bragged about his father's involvement with the Nazis. Sensing something suspicious, Hermann urged Sylvia to investigate further. When she visited Klaus's home, an older man answered the door and introduced himself as Klaus's uncle. But the deception quickly unraveled when Klaus showed up moments later and casually referred to the man as father. This man was Adolf Iikman himself. It was a delicate situation. Hermann did not trust the authorities in Germany to not tip Iikman, nor could he trust the Argentinian police. Because of this, he decided to go to the Israeli government. Knowing Argentina had a history of sheltering Nazi fugitives and was unlikely to extradite a man like Iikman, even if his true identity was confirmed, Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad, took a different approach. It was one that wouldn't depend on diplomatic channels or international courts. After months of surveillance and confirmation, Mossad forces captured Iikman on the 11th of May 1960, just outside his home in a Buenos Aires suburb. He was tackled, blindfolded, and smuggled to a safe house. Over the next 9 days, agents confirmed his identity and planned their escape. On May 20th, 1960, disguised as a flight crew member of Israel's national airline, Iikman was sedated and flown out of Argentina directly to Israel, where his capture was announced the next day. The mission sparked outrage for some. Argentina accused Israel of violating its sovereignty, but for Holocaust survivors and many around the world, it was a moment of long-delayed justice, a ghost from the past, finally dragged into the light. Iikman's trial began in Jerusalem in April 1961. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a historical reckoning, broadcast live and followed around the world. For the first time, many people outside of Europe heard in harrowing detail the testimony of Holocaust survivors. The courtroom became a stage for the voices of the murdered and displaced. Iikman's defense stunned many. He did not deny the facts. He admitted to organizing the deportations and transports. But he claimed he was merely following orders. He stated that there is a need to draw a line between the leaders responsible and the people like me forced to serve as mere instruments in the hands of the leaders. He insisted he had no blood on his hands and no choice in the matter, but the evidence and the testimony told a different story. Witnesses described the trains, the selections, the ghettos emptied with precision. Iikman's own words, captured in interviews and interrogations, revealed a man who took pride in efficiency, a man who, at times, even advocated for more radical measures. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, a journalist who covered the trial, famously described Iikman as embodying the banality of evil, not a sadistic monster, but a chillingly ordinary man whose bureaucratic obedience enabled genocide. On December 15, 1961, Adolf Iikman was found guilty on 15 counts, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against the Jewish people. He was sentenced to death. On the morning of June 1, 1962, Iikman was hanged in Israel as one of just 2 people ever executed by the state. His ashes were scattered at sea. Iikman's trial was more than the judgment of one man. It marked a turning point in how the Holocaust was remembered and studied. For years, the atrocities of the Nazi regime had been largely framed through the lens of military tribunals and high command. But this trial shifted the focus to the victims, the millions of Jews whose stories had often gone untold in the immediate post-war years. It was also a cultural shift. Survivors, many of whom had remained silent for years, began to speak publicly. Their voices helped shape global memory and education about the Holocaust. The trial introduced the world to the systemic nature of the genocide, not just as acts of violence, but as an organized administrative process carried out by men like Iikman. Adolf Iikman was not the highest-ranking Nazi to escape immediate justice, nor was he the only one to hide abroad, but his capture, trial, and execution stand as one of the clearest examples of how some refused to let such crimes disappear into the fog of history. Josef Dietrich. Immediately after World War II, pro-Nazi sentiments remained prevalent in many parts of Germany, despite the regime's official defeat. For years, the Nazi Party had permeated every aspect of German society, education, media, and daily life, creating a deeply ingrained ideological influence that could not be dismantled overnight. Many Germans, especially those who had directly benefited from the regime or had been heavily indoctrinated, continued to sympathize with Nazi ideals or viewed Hitler as a misunderstood patriot rather than a war criminal. Furthermore, widespread devastation, fear of Soviet expansion, and resentment toward the occupying Allied forces contributed to a lingering nationalist sentiment. The initial post-war denazification efforts were inconsistent, and in some cases, former Nazis retained positions of power, allowing elements of the old ideology to persist subtly in public life. Nowhere was this made more clear than at the funeral of Josef Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich had been one of Adolf Hitler's most trusted men. As a senior SS commander and one of the original leaders of the Waffen-SS, this was a brutal murderer and fanatical Nazi, yet over 6,000 attended his funeral to celebrate the man, and this was over 20 years since the regime had ended and its horrors had been brought to light. His funeral was one of the largest public gatherings of former Waffen-SS members in post-war Germany, an unmistakable show of loyalty, defiance, and unresolved memory. Dietrich, for them, wasn't just a general. He was a symbol of camaraderie, of a soldier's pride, and of a lost cause they refused to entirely relinquish. Dietrich had commanded SS units in some of the war's most notorious campaigns. Yet his legacy was stained not just by military service to a genocidal regime, but by direct involvement in war crimes. This included the Malmedy massacre during the Battle of the Bulge, where his men executed American prisoners of war. For that, he was convicted and imprisoned after the war. But even after serving his sentence, Dietrich did not retreat from public life. Instead, he became a central figure in H1AG, a post-war lobby group founded by former Waffen-SS members. IAG's mission was clear: to rehabilitate the image of the Waffen-SS, to lobby for veteran benefits, and to promote a revisionist history that separated the fighting SS from the atrocities of the Holocaust. It was a false distinction, but one that gained traction in parts of West German society during the Cold War. Dietrich, with his fame and network, was crucial in this effort. He gave speeches, wrote memoirs, and lent his name to publications that sought to cast the Waffen-SS as an elite military force, not criminal collaborators. Chieg's rhetoric leaned heavily on themes of honor, sacrifice, and betrayal, deliberately ignoring the ideological and genocidal nature of the SS's mission. In doing so, Dietrich helped shape a dangerous myth that the Waffen-SS were soldiers like any other, unfairly condemned by history. His funeral, with thousands of black-uniformed mourners and carefully orchestrated tributes, was a stark reminder that in 1960s West Germany, the past was not buried. Though we can't know for sure, it wouldn't be surprising if one of those in attendance was Emil Mazu. Like Dietrich, he was a general of the Waffen-SS. He served as the higher SS and police leader in the region of Danzig, West Prussia, a role that placed him at the center of Nazi racial policy and repression in occupied Poland. Under his watch, mass deportations, executions, and the persecution of Jews and Poles were carried out as part of the regime's broader genocidal aims. Yet, like many others in the post-war years, he faded into obscurity. Despite his high rank and the scale of his involvement, Mazu's name rarely appears in mainstream narratives of the SS. His case is a stark example of how many deeply implicated figures avoided lasting scrutiny, not because their actions were minor, but because they operated in the shadows of more famous perpetrators. He died in 1987 at the age of 87. What happened to lower-ranking SS officers? So far, we have focused on the leadership of the SS, the highest up and most powerful. While it is clear that these men bear the greatest responsibility for the crimes of the Third Reich, it is a mistake to view those lower down the chain of command as entirely innocent. The architects of the Holocaust and other atrocities undoubtedly orchestrated the policies and orders, but these plans could not have been carried out without the willing participation of countless rank-and-file SS members. The machinery of atrocity doesn't function on orders alone. It needs people to carry them out. Guards, clerks, drivers, administrators, ordinary men who enabled extraordinary crimes. The SS was vast and far-reaching. At its height, it had a membership of around 800,000 men. While the top-ranking leaders fled and attempted to avoid detection and arrest by the Allies, many of the everyday soldiers were left to defend against the incoming armies. When the Allied forces began liberating the Nazi concentration camps in 1945, they encountered scenes of unimaginable horror. The SS had left behind a legacy of starvation, disease, torture, and mass murder. Many lower-ranking SS guards had been left to defend the site. For many of them, judgment came far more quickly and far less formally. At Dachau, one of the most infamous camps, American troops of the 157th Infantry Regiment arrived in April 1945 to discover hundreds of bodies and emaciated survivors. The rage was immediate. Accounts from that day describe US soldiers turning their weapons on the remaining SS guards, gunning some of them down in what became known as the Dachau Massacre. While some historians debate the exact number killed, there's no doubt that for several SS men a certain kind of justice had been swiftly served. Over in Bergen-Belsen, British forces were similarly overwhelmed by what they found. The camp was a festering pit of disease and corpses, with thousands dead and dying. The SS guards captured there were shown little mercy. British soldiers put them on starvation rations, forced them to clean up the decaying bodies, and beat or stabbed them if they slowed down. These were not acts of protocol. They were acts of vengeance, of visceral retribution against those who had enabled industrial-scale cruelty. Even off the battlefield, some Allied intelligence officers quietly ensured that certain SS guards would never make it to trial. Members of the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps sometimes handed SS prisoners over to displaced persons, many of them former camp inmates knowing full well what would happen. The guard became the prisoner and executions, savage beatings and disappearances followed. This wasn't the rule of law at work, it was something messier. The structured machinery of post-war justice would come later, with trials, verdicts and sentences. But in those first days, right after liberation, when the full scope of Nazi barbarity was laid bare, some justice came unfiltered. While the ethics of this kind of justice are questionable when faced with such pure evil, it is easy to imagine how emotions can overwhelm people. A similar brutal fate awaited any SS officer who found themselves surrendering to the advancing Red Army in the East. Anyone found in an SS uniform was treated with a special disdain, and most of them were sent to work camps and gulags where many would ultimately perish. The brutality of the Red Army in their treatment of the SS could only be matched by the SS themselves. With German manpower waning, younger and younger recruits began being sent out to be slaughtered in the final defense of the country. Many of these new forced recruits had barely gone through puberty. Despite this, they were dressed up in the uniforms of the SS, ensuring that they would be shown no mercy if captured by the enemy. However, for the vast majority of SS personnel, a moment of justice or judgment never came. As the war was drawing to a close, the Allied commanders demanded the arrest of every SS member apprehended, something which was not true of the wider German army. Many thousands of them were subsequently tried, but many thousand more not. Instead, they were allowed to rejoin post-war Germany society. This included everything from bureaucrats and secretaries to camp guards and executioners. As the Cold War emerged, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union shifted their focus toward political rivalry, sometimes overlooking or even recruiting former Nazis for their expertise in intelligence or science. Many lower-ranking SS members also blended back into civilian life, often hiding their affiliations or claiming they had no direct involvement in war crimes. Furthermore, both the newly formed West and East German states were severely low on manpower after the war and faced the urgent task of rebuilding their societies. In such a fragile environment, authorities often avoided widespread prosecutions to prevent reopening old wounds and alienating large portions of the population who had been complicit in or at least affiliated with the Nazi regime. The last SS man tried for crimes. It wasn't until the 21st century that a renewed focus was put on bringing these lower-ranking SS officials to answer for their participation in mass murder. This all happened through the trial of John Demjanjuk. His story is one of the most infamous and controversial chapters in the post-war reckoning with the Holocaust. A Ukrainian-born Red Army soldier captured by the Nazis, Demjanjuk was allegedly recruited by the SS to serve as a guard at several concentration camps. After the war, he emigrated to the United States, settling into a quiet life as an auto worker. But in the late 1970s, his past caught him up. Survivors identified him as Ivan the Terrible, a brutal guard at Treblinka, and in 1986 he was extradited to Israel was approved, where he stood trial in a high-profile case given global media attention. At its conclusion, he was sentenced to death. However, at the last moment, new evidence emerged that cast credible doubt on whether he was actually Ivan the Terrible. Israel's Supreme Court overturned the conviction in 1993, and Demjanjuk returned to the US. That wasn't the end. Further investigations linked him to other Nazi camps, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Flossenbürg, where he served as a Troniki guard, trained by the SS. In 2009, Germany put him on trial not as a sadistic individual, not for any specific moment, murder, or act or violence, but as a cog in the machinery of genocide. The prosecution argued that as a guard of the extermination camp, he was an accessory to the crimes carried out there. He was convicted in 2011 as an accessory to the murder of 28,000 Jews at Sobibor. This conviction marked a turning point in the prosecution of Nazi war crimes. Unlike earlier trials, where prosecutors were required to prove direct involvement in murder, Demjanjuk was found guilty simply for having served as a guard at the Sobibor extermination camp, establishing a crucial legal precedent. This case reshaped the judicial approach by affirming that participation in the functioning of a death camp, even without evidence of specific acts of violence, constituted aiding and abetting mass murder. As a result, German prosecutors gained new momentum to pursue cases that had long been considered legally unviable. In the years since, this precedent has led to a wave of prosecutions, often involving elderly former camp guards or administrative staff men, now in their 90s, who had once played roles, however minor, in the machinery of genocide. Perhaps the last Nazi ever to stand trial will be Gregor Formanek, a 100-year-old former Nazi concentration camp guard. Formanek is accused of aiding and abetting the murder of over 3,300 people while serving at Sachsenhausen concentration camp between 1943 and 1945. A lower court initially ruled him unfit for trial, citing his mental and physical condition. However, a higher court in Frankfurt overturned that decision, saying the trial could go ahead. This case reflects Germany's renewed efforts to prosecute the last living individuals linked to the Nazi regime, as the window for justice is rapidly closing. Many suspects have died or been declared unfit for trial due to age and health issues. With Formanek's advanced age and deteriorating condition, he may be the last Nazi war crime suspect to face a courtroom. As survivors and perpetrators alike pass away, his trial represents both a legal and moral race against time. And the SS was the backbone of Nazi terror, architects of genocide, enforcers of racial policy, and loyal servants of Hitler's vision. Yet when the smoke cleared, the reckoning was incomplete. For every Nuremberg trial, there were dozens of silent pardons, overlooked names, and cases closed without consequence. Cold War politics, bureaucratic inertia, and willful ignorance helped shield those who should have faced the full weight of justice. The Allied powers sought accountability, but geopolitics, bureaucracy, and sheer scale made complete justice impossible. While some of the architects of genocide were hanged, others died peacefully in exile, never having answered for their crimes.